Before the storm of conflict, there was peace. A veteran who had given everything to his country thought he had finally found a life of calm by the lake, living quietly with the dog who would become his shadow. But this calm beginning only makes the clash with the HOA more shocking later. The lake stretched out like glass in the early morning, reflecting the pink hues of dawn. Birds skimmed the water, and the tall pines stood like silent guardians around the small, weathered cabin. Inside, Daniel Carter, a veteran of 2 decades in the U.S. Army, poured himself a mug of coffee, the steam rising slowly as if the world itself refused a rush. He had earned this stillness. After years of deployments, desert heat, sleepless nights, and memories that often returned uninvited, this lakeside home was his refuge. Daniel wasn't a man who asked much from life anymore. Peace was enough. Peace and the steady presence of his German shepherd, Max. The dog padded across the wooden floor, his nails clicking lightly before settling beside Daniel's chair, eyes fixed on him with quiet devotion. To strangers, Max might look like just a dog. To Daniel, he was something much more, an anchor, a reminder that he wasn't alone, even in the silent hours when nightmares shook him awake. Life here followed a rhythm that comforted him. Each morning began with a long walk along the shoreline, Max bounding ahead, ears perked, nose down in every patch of grass, as if the world were endlessly new. Daniel followed with a steady stride, his old service boots crunching against the gravel path. Some mornings, neighbors would wave from a distance, acknowledging him with polite smiles. Others left him to his solitude, which was just as well. Daniel wasn't unfriendly, but he valued the quiet. His cabin wasn't luxurious, but it was his. A single-story structure with a sloping roof and wide porch. It looked out over the lake with the kind of dignity only age can give. The wood had faded to a soft gray, but Daniel kept it well-maintained. A flagpole stood near the porch, the stars and stripes waving gently whenever the breeze picked up. For him, raising that flag each morning was as natural as drinking his coffee. It was a small ritual, a way to honor the life he had lived and the brothers and sisters who had not come home. Max had his own rituals, too. Every morning, he would sit patiently at Daniel's side as the flag went up, as if he understood the weight of the gesture. Then, tail wagging, he would nudge Daniel's hand, demanding the day's first pat on the head. That small, simple exchange meant more than words could. Inside, the walls of the cabin told stories. Framed photos lined the mantel. Daniel in uniform, arm around his platoon brothers, dust rising behind them in some far-off desert. A medal or two tucked into shadow boxes, not displayed to impress, but to remember. And, in one corner, a framed picture of Daniel and Max on the day he brought the pup home from a veteran support program. At first, Daniel hadn't been sure if he was ready for the responsibility of a dog, but Max had proven to be exactly what he needed. To outsiders, Daniel's days might seem uneventful. He spent mornings fishing from the dock, afternoons repairing small things around the cabin, evenings reading on the porch while Max lay at his feet. But for a man who had lived through the chaos of war, the uneventful was a blessing. He didn't need excitement. He needed quiet places where his thoughts could settle without the weight of gunfire echoing in the back of his mind. The neighbors knew little about him, beyond the fact that he was a veteran who kept to himself. Some admired him quietly, respecting his service without intruding. A few whispered about his solitude, wondering why a man his age, barely in his mid-40s, chose to live so alone. But Daniel didn't mind the speculation. He had grown used to living with what others didn't understand. What people didn't see was the way Max steadied him when the memories hit hardest. On nights when Daniel would wake in a sweat, heart pounding from some nightmare replay of a convoy ambush or a comrade's last words, Max would be there instantly, pressing against him, grounding him back in the present. The dog had never been trained for combat or therapy, yet somehow he seemed to know exactly what Daniel needed. That bond was something deeper than ownership. It was survival. Sometimes, Daniel thought about how strange it was to go from leading men into battle to leading a dog along a quiet trail. But that contrast was exactly what he wanted. No more chaos. No more fighting. Just the freedom to live quietly, unbothered, with the only companion who never judged and never asked him to explain what couldn't be explained. Financially, Daniel was fine. His military pension covered his needs, And he wasn't one for extravagance. He drove an old pickup, patched up the cabin himself, and spent little beyond groceries and the occasional repair. For him, wealth was measured in mornings where the only sound was the lap of the lake against the dock, in evenings where he could close his eyes without scanning the horizon for threats. This chapter of his life wasn't about accomplishments or recognition. It was about healing. Every plank of the porch he repaired, every fish he reeled in, every step he took with Max was a piece of that healing. He had built a fragile peace here, one day at a time, like stones stacked carefully against the current of his memories. Of course, life in a community meant there were rules. The neighborhood's homeowners association managed the lake area, ensuring that lawns were trimmed, boats docked properly, and homes kept in acceptable condition. Daniel, though not overly social, followed those rules as best he could. His yard was neat, his cabin well-kept, his behavior respectful. He wasn't the type to stir trouble. In fact, trouble was the last thing he wanted. What he didn't realize, though, was that trouble had a way of finding even those who avoided it. For now, though, the days passed peacefully. Daniel would toss a ball into the yard, watching Max leap joyfully into the air. He would sit on the dock at sunset, his reflection shimmering alongside the dogs as they both gazed at the fading light. He would drift to sleep each night with Max at the foot of his bed, comforted by the steady rhythm of breathing that reminded him he wasn't alone. It was, in many ways, an ordinary life. But for Daniel, ordinary was extraordinary. Ordinary was freedom. Ordinary was peace. And after years of extraordinary chaos, there was nothing he valued more. The world, however, rarely allows peace to last unchallenged. The stillness of the lake and the quiet routines of Daniel's days gave the illusion that life here would remain untouched. Yet, just beyond the cabin's porch and the tranquil trails, another rhythm stirred. One that belonged not to nature, but to rules, regulations, and the watchful eyes of the homeowners association. The HOA had a reputation in this lakeside community. To newcomers, it was described as a way to protect property values and keep the neighborhood looking uniform and desirable. To long-term residents, however, it often felt like a small government of its own, complete with power struggles, fines, and endless reminders that someone was always watching. Every blade of grass, every parked car, every noise after dark could potentially draw attention. Daniel had never cared much for the politics of neighborhood life. He kept his yard tidy, his cabin painted, and his truck parked where it belonged. He assumed that would be enough. But in neighborhoods like this, it wasn't always about what you did. Sometimes it was about who you were or who others thought you were. The first whispers began innocently enough. One morning during his walk with Max, Daniel noticed two women on their porches talking in low tones, glancing his way. Their smiles, polite but thin, vanished the moment his eyes met theirs. He dismissed it at first. He had lived long enough to know that people gossip, and not all gossip mattered. But a few days later, he overheard a sharper tone. As Max trotted happily at his side, Daniel caught a fragment of a neighbor's complaint drifting across the street. "That dog is too big for this community. What if it's dangerous?" Daniel's jaw tightened, though he kept walking. Max, oblivious of the tension, wagged his tail and sniffed at a patch of grass. Dangerous? The thought was almost laughable. Max was disciplined, loyal, and gentle, a companion who never barked without cause and who had proven to be calmer than most people Daniel knew. But perception mattered here, and perception was beginning to shift. By the following week, a formal notice arrived. Folded neatly into his mailbox was a letter bearing the HOA's letterhead. It wasn't aggressive. Not yet. Instead, it was worded as a reminder about community rules regarding pets. Dogs, the letter stated, must be leashed at all times when outdoors and must not create disturbances or pose threats to neighbors. Daniel read the letter twice, irritation rising. He followed those rules already. Max never roamed freely. He was always at Daniel's side on their walks, always within the boundary of the cabin yard. Otherwise, disturbances? The dog hardly barked, except at the occasional squirrel. This wasn't about rules. It was about scrutiny. Someone had complained, and the HOA had responded. He placed a letter on the counter, rubbed Max's ears, and muttered, "They don't know you, buddy." The dog leaned into his touch, eyes calm and trusting. For a while, Daniel chose not to escalate. He lived by a philosophy learned long ago: not every battle was worth fighting. If the HOA wanted to send reminders, so be it. He would continue to live quietly, continue to follow the rules as he always had. But the HOA didn't operate on goodwill. It operated on authority. And when authority went unchallenged, it often grew bolder. At the next monthly HOA board meeting, Daniel's name was mentioned. The minutes of that meeting, later circulated to the community, included a note about concerns regarding a resident's large dog. Phrases like safety hazard and disturbance complaints appeared, though no evidence was cited. The language was vague but pointed, and it ensured that more eyes began turning toward Daniel's cabin. Some neighbors started to avoid him on the walking paths. Parents called their children back when Max came near, even though the dog walked obediently at Daniel's heel. Conversations fell quiet when he approached. None of it was loud enough to be called hostility, but it was loud enough to be felt. For Daniel, it was a familiar kind of isolation, though different from the battlefield of his past. It carried the same sting of being judged by appearances rather than truth. He carried himself with dignity, but inside, unease was creeping in. The HOA didn't stop at notices and meeting notes. Soon, board members began to drop by during their evening rounds. One evening, as Daniel sat on his porch, a man in a polo shirt with the HOA logo strolled up the path, clipboard in hand. He offered a forced smile. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," the man said. "Just checking in. We've had some reports about your dog." Daniel set down his mug, keeping his voice even. "Reports of what?" The man shifted slightly, eyes flicking to Max, who sat calmly at Daniel's side. "What concerns? Some residents feel a dog of this size might be intimidating. We just want to ensure the community feels safe." Max tilted his head, ears perked, as if amused by the accusation. "Max hasn't hurt anyone," Daniel said firmly. "He's leashed, he's quiet, and he's trained. If anyone feels unsafe, that's their perception, not his behavior." The HOA representative scribbled something on his clipboard, still smiling but clearly unsatisfied. "We'll make a note of that. Just keep in mind, we take these matters seriously." With that, he left, leaving behind the uncomfortable weight of being monitored. Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand resting on Max's head. "Feels like they've already made up their minds," he muttered. Weeks passed, and the tension did not ease. Another letter arrived, this time more stern in tone. The HOA stated that multiple complaints had been received and warned that if disturbances continued, fines would be issued. Again, no specifics, only vague accusations wrapped in official language. Daniel knew this was no longer about rules. It was about control. Someone had decided his presence, and Max's, didn't fit neatly into the HOA's pictured community. At night, as Daniel sat on the porch watching the stars, he wondered what it was about him that drew their attention. Was it the flagpole? His solitude? His quiet resistance to playing the neighborly game of barbecues and small talk? Or was it simply the dog, the one thing in his life he couldn't and wouldn't compromise on? Max shifted against his leg, resting his head on Daniel's knee. The steady weight grounded him, just as it always did. He scratched behind the dog's ears and whispered, "They don't know who they're picking a fight with." Still, Daniel wasn't looking for war. He had seen enough of that. He only wanted peace. What he didn't realize was that the HOA's watchful eye wasn't going to look away. It was going to narrow, focus, and strike harder. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped neatly into Daniel's mailbox like any other piece of mail. At first glance, it didn't seem unusual. The HOA sent out community updates regularly, usually filled with reminders about lawn care, parking regulations, or scheduled meetings. But this envelope was different. The paper inside bore bold, formal lettering and an unmistakable headline, "Notice of Violation." Daniel stood by the mailbox for a long moment, the paper heavy in his hand. Max waited at his side, tail wagging absently, as if unaware of the significance of the envelope. Slowly, Daniel tore it open and unfolded the page. The notice was blunt. It stated that Daniel's property was in violation of HOA rules due to ongoing disturbances caused by his animal. The wording was vague, but the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't a friendly reminder. It was a warning. If the disturbances continued, fines would follow. Repeated violations, a notice stated, could result in further action up to and including legal steps by the HOA. Daniel's jaw clenched. He read the notice again, searching for specifics. What disturbances? What evidence? The paper offered none. It merely referenced multiple complaints from neighbors. He crumpled the letter slightly in his grip, then exhaled and forced himself to relax. Losing his temper wouldn't help. He had dealt with worse than this. With deliberate calm, he tucked the notice under his arm, scratched Max's head, and walked back to the cabin. Inside, he laid the letter on the kitchen table and studied it under the warm glow of the hanging light. The more he read it, the clearer it became. This wasn't about rules. It was about pressure. Someone wanted him gone, and they were using the HOA as their weapon. Daniel wasn't the kind of man to let fear guide him. Instead, he decided to face the issue head-on. The next day, he drafted a response, respectful, measured, and clear. He explained that his dog was leashed at all times, that Max was registered and up-to-date on vaccinations, and that he had never caused harm or posed a danger. He even included a note about Max's role as an emotional support companion, outlining how the dog helped him manage the lasting effects of his military service. He delivered the letter in person at the HOA office, a small building at the edge of the neighborhood that looked more like a converted storage shed than the headquarters of authority it pretended to be. Behind the counter sat a woman in her 50s with sharp glasses and sharper eyes. Her nameplate read Karen Mitchell, HOA secretary. She skimmed his letter with practiced disinterest, lips pursed as though she had read hundreds like it before. "We appreciate your response, Mr. Carter," she said flatly. "But complaints have been made, and the board takes them seriously." Daniel kept his tone calm. "Complaints without evidence don't mean my dog is a threat. Max hasn't done anything wrong. He's quiet, well-trained, and always leashed." Karen adjusted her glasses and glanced at the clock, already dismissive. "I'm sure you believe that. But the board's responsibility is to the community as a whole. If residents feel unsafe, it's our duty to act." Daniel felt irritation simmer beneath his composure. So feelings outweigh facts? That's what this is. Her lips curved into a thin smile that wasn't a smile at all. This is about maintaining harmony. If there are no issues, then you have nothing to worry about. Just keep in mind, further disturbances will result in fines. With that, she slid his letter into a file folder, closing it as if sealing away his words where they'd never be read again. Daniel walked out of the office, his shoulders tight, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He wasn't a man who liked confrontation, but he also wasn't a man who tolerated injustice. He had spent his life serving a country that valued freedom, and now he was being told that feelings carried more weight than truth. That evening, as he sat on the porch with Max, the notice lay on the table beside him, its words etched into his thoughts. He knew the HOA wasn't finished. The letter had been their opening move. Sure enough, within days, a second notice arrived. This one carried a fine, $100 for failure to comply with HOA guidelines regarding pet behavior. Daniel stared at the paper in disbelief. Failure to comply? He had followed every rule. There was nothing to comply with because Max had done nothing wrong. The fine wasn't about money. Daniel could afford $100. It was about control. It was about making him bend, making him question whether it was worth the fight. The HOA was probing, testing how far they could push. He considered attending the next HOA board meeting, not just sending letters, but speaking directly. The thought of sitting in a room full of people who had already judged him made his stomach knot. But silence wasn't working. They needed to hear his voice to see his resolve. When the evening of the meeting came, Daniel put on a clean shirt, brushed Max's coat until it shone, and walked into the community center where the board gathered. Residents sat in folding chairs, murmuring softly, their eyes flicking toward him as he entered. The board sat at a long table, papers stacked neatly, their expressions set in practiced neutrality. The chairwoman, a stern woman named Linda, called the meeting to order. When it came time for resident concerns, Daniel stood. His voice was steady, his back straight. He spoke not as a man pleading, but as a man explaining calmly, logically. My dog, Max, has been accused of causing disturbances. I want to make it clear, he is leashed at all times. He does not roam. He does not bark excessively, and he has never harmed anyone. The only complaints being made are based on perception, not facts. Max is also an emotional support animal, prescribed to help me manage service-related stress. Removing him is not an option. For a moment, silence hung in the air. A few residents shifted uncomfortably, some nodding faintly as though they agreed with him. But the board members exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Finally, Linda leaned forward. We appreciate your service, Mr. Carter, and we understand your position. But we also have to consider the community as a whole. If members feel uneasy, that is a legitimate concern. We cannot ignore multiple complaints. Daniel's patience thinned. You're asking me to accept punishment for a crime that doesn't exist. My dog isn't the problem. The problem is that some people don't like the way he looks or the way I live quietly. That's not a violation, that's prejudice. Murmurs rippled through the audience. A few heads nodded again, more firmly this time, but the board remained unmoved. Linda tapped her pen against the table. We'll review this further, but until then, the fine stands. Daniel left the meeting with his jaw set, his resolve hardening. He had tried reason. He had tried calm explanations. But the board wasn't interested in fairness. They wanted compliance. They wanted control. Back at the cabin, Max curled beside him as Daniel sat staring out at the lake. The notices lay in a small stack on the table inside, each one a reminder that his piece was being chipped away piece by piece. He stroked Max's head and whispered, "We're not backing down, buddy. Not for them. Not ever." What Daniel didn't know was that the HOA was only getting started. The notices and fines were just the beginning of a campaign that would push him closer and closer to the edge. The morning sun cast its golden glow across the lake. But for Daniel, the peace it once promised had started to slip away. Each day brought a new envelope, a new notice, a new fine. The stack on his kitchen counter had grown thicker, each sheet of paper a reminder that his quiet refuge was no longer his own. The first fine had been $100, then $200, then $500. The amount increased not because of new violations, but because the HOA claimed his refusal to correct the problem meant the issues were ongoing. They listed vague charges: excessive noise, failure to control pet, community disruption. None of it was true. Max slept most of the day at his feet, and only barked when someone approached the cabin. Daniel kept him leashed every time they went out. Still, the HOA framed every innocent act as defiance. He tried to remain calm. Every military instinct in him told him that losing his temper would only give his adversaries the upper hand. But as he held the latest fine in his hand, this one for $750, he felt his chest tighten with anger. He set the paper down on the table with deliberate care, then rubbed the bridge of his nose, trying to ease the pounding in his head. "Max," he muttered, looking down at his dog sprawled by the fireplace. "They're trying to break us." Max lifted his head, ears twitching, and gave a quiet whine as if to reassure him. Daniel managed a small smile and reached down to scratch behind his ears. The dog's steady presence reminded him of what mattered. No matter how heavy the pressure grew, he would not give up, but the battle was no longer confined to notices and fines. It was spilling into the streets. On his walks with Max, Daniel began to notice the way neighbors watched him. Some offered a nod or a polite wave, their eyes soft with sympathy. Others turned away, their expressions tightening as though his very presence was a disruption. The whispers followed him, half-heard fragments carried on the breeze. "That's the guy with the dog, the one causing trouble with the HOA." One afternoon, as Daniel passed by a row of neatly kept homes, an older man named Richard, who had lived in the community for over a decade, stepped off his porch and approached him. "Daniel," Richard said quietly, glancing around as if afraid to be seen speaking with him, "I just want you to know, not everyone agrees with what they're doing. My wife and I think it's ridiculous. That dog of yours is better behaved than half the kids in this neighborhood." Daniel's heart lifted slightly at the kindness. "I appreciate that. Sometimes it feels like I'm standing alone out here. You're not, Richard assured him. But be careful. The board doesn't like being challenged. They'll make this ugly before they give in. Not everyone was as supportive. A few days later, while Daniel was tending the small patch of garden beside his porch, a woman walking her own dog stopped on the sidewalk. Her tone was sharp, her voice pitched high enough for the surrounding houses to hear. Maybe if you kept that animal under control, we wouldn't have to deal with all this mess, she said, tugging her poodle closer. Daniel stood slowly, dirt on his hands, and forced himself to stay calm. Ma'am, Max hasn't hurt anyone. He's always on a leash. She scoffed. That's not what I've heard. People are saying he growls, that he's dangerous. This is a family neighborhood. We shouldn't have to live in fear. Her words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. Fear? Max was gentle, loyal, protective, but never dangerous. Yet the more the HOA painted him as a threat, the more people seemed willing to believe it. Later that week, Daniel attended another HOA meeting. The atmosphere was tense, the whispers louder than before. He spoke again, calmly laying out the facts, showing evidence. Veterinary records, proof of training, testimony from a neighbor who supported him. But the board sat unmoved. Linda, the chairwoman, tapped her pen against the table as she listened. Mr. Carter, we've reviewed your documentation, but it doesn't change the reality of the situation. Multiple residents have expressed concerns. The board has a responsibility to act in the best interest of the community. Daniel clenched his jaw. And what about my rights? What about the fact that these complaints are unfounded? Karen, the secretary, leaned forward. Perhaps if you showed more willingness to cooperate, this wouldn't have to escalate. The word cooperate hung in the air like a threat. Daniel understood its meaning. Surrender, comply, or be crushed under the weight of fines and bureaucracy. He left the meeting in silence, but his resolve hardened with every step. They wanted to break him, to push him out, but he wouldn't give them the satisfaction. He had faced enemies before, ones with weapons, not just paperwork. He could endure this too. Back home, however, the pressure gnawed at him. Bills piled up as the fines grew. Though he hadn't paid them, refusing to acknowledge their legitimacy, the amounts loomed large and the threats of legal action grew louder. Letters warned that unpaid fines could lead to liens against his property. The idea that his cabin, the one place he had built with his own hands, could be taken from him left him restless at night. Max, sensing his unease, stayed closer than ever, resting his head on Daniel's knee whenever he sat at the table with yet another notice in his hands. The dog's quiet loyalty gave him strength, but it didn't erase the isolation. The community itself had become a battleground. At the local store, some neighbors avoided his gaze entirely, pretending not to see him. Others whispered quick words of encouragement when no one else was looking, and a few, emboldened by the HOA stance, muttered insults as they passed. Daniel bore it all with the same restraint he had learned in uniform. Stand tall, remain respectful, don't let them see you break. But beneath the calm exterior, frustration and helplessness churned. He had fought for freedom overseas, only to return home and face oppression in his own neighborhood. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching the sunset, Richard came by again. They won't stop, Daniel. You know that, right? Daniel nodded slowly. Yeah, I know. Richard hesitated, then added, but you're not wrong to fight. Some of us see what they're doing. It's not about the dog. It's about power. Don't let them win. Daniel looked out across the lake, the fading light painting the water in streaks of gold and crimson. His hands tightened on the armrest of his chair. He wouldn't give in. No matter how heavy the pressure grew, he refused to let the HOA dictate his life. What he didn't realize was that the tension was about to boil over, not just in letters and fines, but in open conflict, with neighbors taking sides more fiercely than ever before. The letter arrived on a gray morning, tucked neatly into the mailbox like all the others. Daniel had grown accustomed to finding those envelopes waiting for him, each one bearing the HOA's letterhead and filled with fines, warnings, and demands. But this envelope fell heavier in his hand, its edges sharper, its weight more ominous. He carried it inside, laid it on the kitchen table, and stared at it for several long minutes before finally breaking the seal. The word struck him like a punch to the chest. Notice of eviction proceedings. Failure to remove the animal in question within 14 days will result in legal action to terminate your residency and reclaim the property. Daniel read the lines again, slowly, as if his eyes were playing tricks on him. His hand trembled slightly as he set the paper down. He had expected escalation, yes, but eviction? The threat of losing his home, the sanctuary he had built with his own hands, felt like betrayal carved in ink. Max, sensing the shift in the air, patted over and pressed his head against Daniel's leg. The dog's warmth steadied him for a moment, but inside, something cracked. He pulled out a chair and sank into it, the paper clutched in his fist. His gaze drifted toward the window, out to the lake glimmering softly under the pale morning light. Memories surged unbidden. The nights overseas when he had lain awake listening to mortar fire, thinking only of someday finding a quiet place to call his own. The years of service, the medals earned, the friends lost. All of it had led him here, to this small cabin, to this fragile peace. And now, a group of neighbors with clipboards and rules threatened to strip it away, because of Max. For the first time since the conflict began, Daniel felt the weight of hopelessness settle over him. He had faced enemies with weapons and survived, but this enemy was different. There were no rules of engagement, no clear battlefield. Just endless paperwork, mounting fines, and now the ultimate threat. Exile from the one place that felt like home. He folded forward, resting his elbows on the table, pressing his hands against his face. What did I fight for? He whispered to himself. What was it all for if I can't even keep my own home with my dog in peace? Max whined softly, nuzzling closer, his tail thumping against the floor in gentle reassurance. Daniel reached down, running his hand to the dog's fur, and for a moment the world steadied again. But the bitterness remained. The sense of betrayal cut deeper than anything else. He had believed that service earned respect, that sacrifice meant security, that home was sacred. Yet here he was, cornered by people who had never stepped onto a battlefield, who wielded power not through honor or courage, but through paperwork and petty rules. That night, Daniel sat on the porch long after the sun went down, staring out at the dark water. His mind replayed the words of the notice over and over. Terminate your residency. The phrase felt cold, clinical, like he was nothing more than a line item in a ledger. He thought of the men he had lost overseas, of the promises they had made each other about living life to the fullest if they made it home. He thought of the flag folded neatly in a box in his bedroom, a reminder of his fallen comrades. And he thought of the irony that he, who had defended his country, now had to defend himself from the very people he thought he was protecting. Sleep eluded him. When he finally lay down, his dreams were a haze of noise, shouting voices, barking dogs, the sound of gavel strikes echoing like gunfire. He awoke drenched in sweat, Max nudging him awake with anxious eyes. The following days blurred together in a haze of tension. Every time he saw a neighbor glance his way, he wondered who had filed the latest complaint. Every sound of footsteps near his property made his chest tighten, fearing the next step in the HOA's campaign. He started to avoid the mailbox altogether, letting the envelopes pile up until he couldn't ignore them anymore. His reflection in the mirror began to change. The strong, steady man who once carried himself with the confidence of a soldier now looked weary, the lines on his face etched deeper, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He tried, once more, to appeal to the HOA. He wrote a letter, respectful, carefully worded, detailing his years of service, the role Max played in his recovery, the sacrifices he had made. He ended it with a simple plea. All I ask is to live in peace with the dog who has been my anchor. Surely compassion can prevail. He hand-delivered the letter to the HOA office, sliding it across the desk to Linda herself. She read it with an expression of polite detachment, her lips pressed into a thin line. We appreciate your service, she said mechanically, as if reading from a script. But the rules are the rules. Exceptions cannot be made without undermining the integrity of the community. Daniel's jaw tightened. Integrity? He echoed softly, anger simmering beneath his calm tone. Do you really believe this is about integrity? Or is it about power? Linda's eyes narrowed. That's enough, Mr. Carter. You have 14 days. Remove the animal, or the board will proceed. He left the office with his fists clenched, fighting to keep his composure. Every step home felt heavier, every breath tighter. The clock was ticking, and for the first time, Daniel wasn't sure he could win this battle. That evening, he sat on the floor of his cabin, Max curled up beside him. The fire crackled quietly, casting long shadows across the room. Daniel rested a hand on his dog's back and whispered, "They want me to give you up, but I can't. I won't. You're all I've got." Max shifted, pressing closer, as though he understood. Tears pricked Daniel's eyes, and he let them fall freely, unashamed. It wasn't weakness. It was grief. Grief for the peace that was slipping away, for the betrayal he felt in his own homeland, for the cruel irony that he could fight wars abroad, but not protect his own life at home. The days ahead stretched like a dark horizon, and for the first time, Daniel felt truly cornered. Hope was slipping, replaced by a hollow ache of despair. And yet, deep within that ache, a flicker of resolve remained, faint but unbroken. He didn't know how he would fight back. He didn't know if he could. But one thing was certain. He would not abandon Max, no matter the cost.